What is tragedy? In this video, we begin a series on neoclassical tragedy, that is to say, the tragedies that were written and performed in France in the middle and late 17th century. And we begin by looking at the principle of the Three Unities, the theoretical underpinning of many of these works. The Three Unities are the unities of time, place, and action. And they were formulated most thoroughly by the Italian theorist Castelvetro in the 16th century and by the French dramatist Pierre Corneille in the late 17th century. And these theorists regularly cited Aristotle as the justification for their own theatrical principles. And yet we do not find the Three Unities in Aristotle's Poetics. Indeed, we only just about find one, the unity of action. And that is very different from the form it will take in 17th century French discourse. Aristotle says that you cannot give unity to a tragic drama simply by bundling together all the incidents that happened in a single person's life, for example, by recounting the exploits of the hero Heracles. That's not enough to give unity, a satisfying aesthetic and indeed moral shape to a play. Rather, what Aristotle thinks gives unity to tragedy is that the actions should follow as consequences of the error, the tragic hamartia, the mistake, the terrible error of judgment committed by the tragic protagonist. It's the error and the consequences of that error that together have a unity. A dramatic unity and, as I've just suggested, also a moral unity, directing our attention at the outcome of that initial error. Now, this is a very different concept of unity of action from the neoclassical principle, as we shall see in a moment. And underlying the principle of the Three Unities, as formulated by Corneille, is the idea of what he called the vraisemblable. And we can translate that as the likely, the probable, the true to life. And he thought that the unities of time, place, and action would convince an audience that what they see on stage is indeed vraisemblable, likely, true to life. If we look at the first of these, the unity of time, we see that this principle insists that there should be a close match between the time span of the play in performance and the time span which the play represents. There should be a truth to life in that respect, a truth of correspondence. And in practice, this means that normally the action which the play represents should not take much more time than the experience of the audience in the theatre, and certainly not more than 24 hours. As for the unity of place, this principle says that the action should be restricted to a single location, ideally a single room, or if not, a single house or street. This is the exact opposite, of course, of what we often find in Shakespeare, whose plays, like Pericles, wander happily over the Mediterranean, or like Antony and Cleopatra, oscillate between Roman and Egyptian settings. That idea is entirely alien to the neoclassical principle of unity of place. and it would have been derided as wildly improbable, not true to life. As for the third of these unities, the unity of action, and we can see here how different this is from Aristotle's principle. The action on stage should be continuous. There should be no break between the scenes, so that at least one character should remain on stage to form a link. The stage should not be left empty. And this is the principle known as the liaison des scènes, the joining of the scenes. But there may be a break allowed between acts. Otherwise it would have been difficult to construct such a play, and it would well have tired the actors. Particularly because they are so different from the kinds of dramatic construction that we're familiar with from, say, Shakespeare. These neoclassical unities can all too often appear to be arbitrary restraints on the creativity of a playwright. But I want to suggest now that these unities are in fact, in the hands of a master such as Corneille or Racine, opportunities for a kind of creativity which intensifies the tragic experience. Let's take the question of time to start with. The unity of time forces a concentration. There is no opportunity for rambling. There's a tight construction. And one of the effects of this is that the plays often focus our attention on the present moment in which decisions are made. And we see the process of decision making, and we see the immediate consequences of those moments of decision because of the unity of action. We see how consequences follow from a particular speech. We also see how consequences follow from silence. In Racine's Phèdre, for example, the silence of Phèdre is a crucial element in how the plot unfolds. And because the play represents the present in a rather restricted way, the playwright needs to find inventive ways of drawing our attention to the past of these characters, because it is one of the characteristics of tragedy that the present is likely to be haunted by the past. Characters are very rarely free to act as they wish in the present moment. In that respect, the past is never really past, it's never really over and done with. And so tragic characters tend to inhabit simultaneously the present and a version of the past which is often carried with them as a burden. And here the rhetorical figure of analepsis is important. Analepsis is what we know more colloquially as a flashback. It's a movement back from the present moment into an earlier stage of the story. And it's a way, therefore, of drawing the past into the present, showing how the past moment affects the present step by step. And there are two striking examples of this in Racine's work. The first is in his play Andromaque, where Andromaque, the widow of the Trojan hero Hector, is never really inhabiting the present. She is more profoundly still inhabiting the past, still living in the ruins of Troy, as it were. Not living in the ruins literally, but metaphorically, psychologically, she inhabits the ruins of Troy. And indeed, she goes to consult her dead husband Hector At one point in the play, she even speaks in Hector's voice. That's a way in which Racine can take advantage of the unity of time by indicating how powerful the past still is in the mind and indeed the heart of Andromaque. Then there's another important example in his play Phèdre, where Phèdre has a long speech recalling how she first set eyes on her stepson Hippolyte, with whom she is deeply in love. She recalls the incident in the temple where she was making a sacrifice to the goddess of love, but all the time thinking about the young man, in effect sacrificing to him. And that is not just a memory. It's an explanation, or an attempt at an explanation, of how it is that her present moment is consumed by her passionate desire for this young man. There is a continuity between the moment when she first saw him, the moment when she sacrifices in the temple, and the present moment when her desire is still raging in her bones and in her blood. That past is never past. And as for tragic place, well, particularly in Racine's plays, the space of tragedy is often claustrophobic. We are often shown characters who, in effect, are trapped within one form of prison or another. And there are restrictions on the character's room to maneuver. That's both literally, the question of whether they can actually make an exit from a particular space is often important, and symbolically, their room for maneuver is limited, because of course tragedy very often directs our attention to the problem of free will and agency. Are we free to move? Are we free to move out of the claustrophobic spaces that Racine creates? And this is why many successful productions of neoclassical plays use abstract or semi-abstract sets, because the spaces of tragedy are not really literal. And if we have a stage which is too obviously representational and too obviously cluttered with detail, that can distract us from seeing how the space of tragedy is a space of the mind. It's a psychological space. In the illustration that we saw a moment ago from a production of Andromaque, that scene is suitably abstract. And here, in the picture from a production of Britannicus, we see that in this modern set, there is almost nothing. A big door, a big window that looks out on nothing, and a few chairs. It's enough to suggest the claustrophobia of the imperial palace, where the Emperor Nero lurks at one point, overhearing an important conversation. Who lurks behind the closed or the half-closed doors? And to return for a moment to Andromaque, I've already suggested the importance of the memory of Troy for Andromaque. I've suggested that she lives as much in the past of Troy as in the present. And so Troy becomes an important psychological space. She inhabits Troy in her own mind, and it is of course her version of Troy, not a version of Troy that we can find on the map or in any other literary text. And as for tragic action, there is a concentration on key moments. Like this key moment from Racine's Phèdre, where the two characters, Phèdre and her stepson Hippolyte, are joined by this sword, which is later in the play to become evidence that he has tried to attack her. A concentration on key moments, on significant objects, on significant moments of speech and of silence. We see the almost inevitable and, as it were, claustrophobic connections that lead from one speech to another, from one speech to a desperate act, or from speech to silence, from silence to speech. It's the unity of action that focuses our attention on these links. And that is not only a dramatic, it's a moral question, because it allows us to concentrate on the question of responsibility. Characters have to take responsibility for the consequences of their speech and, as in the case of Phèdre, responsibility for their silence. And so the principle of the unity of action has both dramatic and philosophical consequences. So I hope to have suggested in this video that the principle of the three unities is not a sterile and stifling convention that inhibits dramatic creativity. Rather, it can be a source of dramatic tension. It can enable a dramatist to represent the psychological complexity of his characters by his subtle location of them in different forms of time and space, not just the literal ones. And it's a convention that aids the mapping of moral responsibility, as it shows us the direct connections between cause and effect, between one speech and another, between one speech and action. It is therefore a very important resource for mapping the essential tragic questions about autonomy, agency, and free will. And here is a book that provides a useful guide to the French neoclassical critics.